My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive, and we are going across the pond today, which technology-wise is pretty amazing. I'm speaking with Rick Margitza, who is in Paris. Is that correct?
Yes, nice to be here.
Nice to be talking to you,
Well,
and congratulations on your career so far.
oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
I have a little anecdote I'll start with. This goes back a number of years. I was on the way home from a gig and listening to an all-night jazz radio station. I don't remember where it came from, but this song came on. Excuse my vocalizing. Ba dee da 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 da.
Nice voice.
How
Yeah,
about the rendition? Do you recognize it?
yes, it's from my first record. Actually, the first track. It's called Widow's Walk.
Yes. I was drawn into that even actually before you came in with the melody, with that sequence of chords, the arpeggiated. So
Hmm.
I'd like to start with asking about that, and in a larger sense, your composing efforts. Do you recall the process of writing that song? And I hope when we're done that people watch this, they'll go listen to it because it's just gorgeous.
Thank you. Yes, I do because certain songs come out really quickly, and others take a while to work through. And for whatever reason, it just happens like that. And one is not necessarily better than the other. But Widow's Walk literally came out in about a half an hour.
Wow.
It's one of those that came really quickly. And I when I first started composing, a lot of it was at the piano. So I remember finding that ostinato at the beginning and trying it over different roots because it's a kind of thing that fits over different roots, which makes it a different mode or a different chord. So once I found the bass line that basically kind of takes you through the song over that or under the ostinato, I kind of had the shell of the song first, and then kind of improvised the melody over the form of the song.
You improvised the melody.
Well, not complete. I mean, I kind of came up with this little descending line, and then I tinkered with it. So when I improvised it, it wasn't in its final form, but I just kind of came up with that melody as a result of hearing the ostinato and the chords. Um, and I mean, these days, I've, there's a I think it's from Pat Metheny. He said everybody has about 7 or 8 tunes in them, and they keep writing different versions of that same tune. So I'm getting to that point where I'm repeating myself, or I feel like I'm repeating myself. So I'm forcing myself to compose in different ways. So I'm trying to not start with the piano anymore. Since my piano playing is somewhat limited, I tend to move in the same harmonic worlds or the same kind of things that feel good under my hands. So now I'm trying to maybe just find the melody on the saxophone first, or maybe find uh, a drum beat or some type of groove. Oh, sorry.
I can totally relate to
Yeah.
that because I usually start at the piano myself, and like I'm not a fantastic piano player, so I do find that I'm trying to put my hands down in different ways. Like, and you mentioned bass notes. Like, instead of thinking I'm before your hands hit out, can I do some E flat thing? Like, just put your hands down and see what happens.
Yes, exactly. Just forcing myself just to come from different places. And that's actually kind of been fruitful. I found a couple, not full songs yet, but things that feel different. Um, and it might also be something I'd be watching a movie or a TV show and just hear a groove that wouldn't be something that I would normally start with, and just kind of do a little bit of uh, well, I don't know whose quote this is, but they say in literature it's plagiarism, but in music it's influence.
Ah, I'll
So
see
there
if
are a
I can
couple.
remember this. Pepper Adams, Jerry Dodgen told me this story. Pepper Adams, they were in front of a whole group of students, and they're talking about influences and so forth. And Pepper said, If you take from one person, it's plagiarism. If you take from everybody, it's research.
That's a good one. That's really good.
Do you ever get an idea in your head, either from the piano or sax, and then go for a walk and find that you're working out possibilities in your head?
Yes. Actually, I shouldn't say developed the ability over the years. Is just something that has happened is even without, even like aside from composing, is that I will practice in my head. Um, and there's was recently an interesting little, I think it was one of those things called profiles in Downbeat, where it wasn't a full blown article about Jerry Bergonzi. And he said sometimes he'll just go and sit down or lay down on a couch and practice in his head for an hour. And so uh, I've kind of, when you're waiting at the airport and you find yourself in these situations where you have time to kill, I actually have kind of been over the years trying to utilize that time by taking an idea or a motive and going through all the keys or a certain song and practicing it in different keys in my head and just kind of imagining the sound and trying to feel the vibrations. And it actually is something I actually work with my students on doing. So I think that's actually a very beneficial thing to do. And then to answer your first question, yes, I do sometimes will go for a walk and work through something that might be part of a song, not a whole song. And then come back and try to get it down on paper and then work it through. There's a Schoenberg book, a couple of his, one of them is called Style and Idea. And it's a book, a collection of his essays and articles and commentaries and criticism. It's like, it's genius, just so many amazing, really interesting things. And he composed away from the piano, whereas Stravinsky composed everything at the piano, supposedly. I mean, I'm sure there's a little bit of overlap there, but and he was talking about his, I think Schoenberg was talking about his fourth string quartet, and he said he would go out for his morning walks and write 20 measures and then come back and spend the rest of the afternoon transcribing what he just wrote. And if you listen to the first movement of that string quartet, it is so complex. It's like I go out and try to write a blues in my head and I can't do that. And he's writing 4 parts. It's it's extraordinary.
That's stunning. There's a, not to get too much into the weeds, but in Widow's Walk there is a chord, and it occurs, I think, in measure 7. And am I correct that basically the song's in D minor?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a chord in measure 7 that baba de big, and it goes up and lands on an F sharp.
Right.
I love it, and it's so arresting, but not unpleasant.
Yes, that to me, that's I don't want to say the whole beauty of the song, but that one note is the note that kind of sets up the whole turnaround. And it is a really, it's like if you're looking at a painting of yellows and oranges, that's like one little dot of purple in it that really stands out. And it's because it's the 2 chord, so it would be, so we're in D minor, it's E half diminished, but with the natural 9, with the F sharp, which really sets up the flat 13 over the A7, because without that, then you have those 2 F naturals in a row over the 2 and then the 5. So I love that movement of natural 9 on the half diminished chord, which, like you just said, not to get too into the weeds, but that comes from the melodic minor scale. It's the 6th degree, so it's half diminished with a natural 9, as opposed to thinking about it as a Locrian chord, which gives you the flat 9 over the half diminished, which is a sound I really never really liked in that situation. So
Did you, at the moment, think that about what you were playing at the piano, or did you play it and then put those terms to it?
uh, I think they kind of happen simultaneously because I was thinking, like I said, the form kind of just dictated itself. So it just felt like it was just going to be a 16 measure song. So nothing like AABA, nothing but a bridge. I was just thinking about just kind of a smaller repeating form. So I knew at that point I needed the turnaround to get back to the one chord. And I know since I'm in minor, I always usually treat the two chord with that sharp, with the natural nine. So it kind of just came out because that's kind of what my ear was pre-hearing.
Mhm.
But intellectually, that's something that I kind of have thought about. So when I get to that point in most songs, that's the kind of the note I'll try to fit in a voicing somewhere, if that makes sense.
Yes, and it worked. There's a
Thank
little
you.
review here from one of those jazz collections book about CDs, and the reviewer was talking about this recording, the whole record, and he said the long Rollinish cadenza on My Foolish Heart, the compelling circles cast through Widow's Walk, the neo blues shapes of Steppin' Out. Um, there's not a bad passage on the disc. Pretty
Wow,
nice.
that's a nice one.
Yeah,
I'll take it.
you take that. You had compelling circles. Before we get off this composing topic, I've seen that you've written some larger works, concerto.
Hmm.
Have you had that experience where you work? We get used to in the jazz world, a song can be 7 minutes long because it includes improvisation by the band members. I'm wondering, because this has happened to me, like I labor on something that's more in a classical nature and I like it, and then I play it back and I go, wow, okay, I have 40 seconds so far.
Yeah,
It's a different bag for sure.
it really is. 2 minutes worth of music. I was reading an article interview of Vince Mendoza, and he was talking about 2 or 3 minutes of music and how much that actually is without any improvising. That's a lot of music to compose to fill. Yeah, that because we're so used to just having something, just a little blues head, and then the solos could take up most of the space. But um, yeah, it's a challenge, obviously, and it's I'm a huge fan of Mahler, so his time scale is huge. Um, you know, half an hour movements are nothing for him. Sometimes they're longer than that, and then you have hour long, hour 20-minute symphonies. So I've studied a lot of his scores. So my orchestral writing is nothing I really studied with anybody on. It was more about looking at scores, doing a lot of listening, and actually reading biographies and autobiographies of composers. So when they talk about their process, that was to me really informative.
Hmm. You and Alan Broadbent, he's a Mahler aficionado, I'll
Oh,
say.
really?
Yes.
Wow.
Do you consider your I'll just use the word classical or orchestral.
Hmm.
Is it what's the term? Through composed, which I believe means not necessarily themes developed and returned to.
Um, yes. There's might be a little bit of that themes. Well, definitely themes developed. But if I return to something, I try not to ever return to it verbatim. Um, there's a phrase used when people, and I think it was Schoenberg talking about Brahms, about constant variation. So you're really thinking about kind of planting a seed and then it growing and never changing. It always turns into something different, but you can backtrack and see how it relates to the first little seed that was planted. Um, the Ninth Symphony of Mahler, the first movement, it's extraordinary. That's one of my favorites. One thing, because harmonically, it's kind of the last one. It's the bridge between all the late romantic classical music and symphonies, and it turns into Schoenberg and Webern and Berg. That's kind of the one movement that almost breaks tonality. And within the first, I think it's 6 measures, there were 5 or 6 different little things that happen. And those things continue for the next 30 minutes, but in different registers, different instruments, different modes. And it's almost like this organism that is breathing for a half an hour and constantly changing. And it's extraordinary. So when I compose, I try to think like that, where there's these little elements that are parts of the fabric, but are kind of moving and taking on different roles, and just developing themselves, kind of letting them be what they need to be or want to be.
Oh, nice description. I think you just used the term breaking with tonality. If I hope I'm quoting you correctly. And it makes me think about I was looking at some of your transcribed solos online. First of all, have you looked at your transcribed solos online?
Solos that I have done of other people?
And other people have transcribed them. Yeah.
Oh, you mean some people have transcribed my playing?
Correct.
Oh, yeah, because there are some transcriptions that I did of other players that are out there as well. Yes, I actually, there was a book that was out a while ago, and the person who did the transcriptions, he's actually really, really fine saxophonist from Michigan, John Wojciechowski. He actually sent me, I think there are like 10 solos in this book, to edit them to make sure that they were correct.
How do you know they're correct?
Well, I can kind of tell just by reading through them, and if I wasn't sure, I would listen to the recording.
Okay.
And check it against.
The reason I said that so quickly is because
no, it's okay.
I was looking at them, and there's things in there in many of your solos that, from a harmonic standpoint, are breaking the tonality. I'm going to use that term because you used it. Mm-hmm. For instance, the chord symbols is A minor,
right?
And you're playing a C sharp.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out, I don't have a question here, but this idea of playing outside the change has fascinated me. It's something I have trouble doing myself.
Mm-hmm.
Is in your head, is there theory behind that? Or I did notice that a lot of times when you're playing outside the change, it's part of a sequence you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a phrase and you're going to repeat it, but you're going to move up or down, even though, let's say, the chord may not go with that. I don't know what you can do with that comment, but
yeah. Well, I'm not sure if you talked about having notes for what we're going to talk about. If I have a book that came out in January, if that's going to be part of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I'd like to get to that, the 365 days.
Right. So in that book, so we could talk about the structure of the book later, but in the beginning of that book, I talk about this practice routine that I kind of learned and developed as a result of studying with the great saxophone player named Gary Campbell, who was teaching at the University of Miami when I was there some years ago, and who also went to Indiana University when Michael Brecker was there. So they used to practice together. And Michael always credits Gary as being a big influence on his practicing. So this is all a preface to answering your question. Part of this practice method is thing called the intervallic families. And that comes from dividing up the octave. So there's half steps, whole steps, minor thirds, major thirds, fourths, tritones, and fifths. And then after fifths, any interval bigger than that could be what's the word, reverted back to one of the other intervals. So say, for example, a minor sixth from C to A flat is just an inversion of a major third from A flat to C. And in a major sixth from C to A is just an inversion of a minor third. So basically you have half steps, whole steps, minor thirds, major thirds, fourths, and fifths. So if you memorize those groups, then you start seeing how you could get from any note in any key over any chord. So for example, you say A minor, and then you say C sharp. So if you think about A minor moving up in major thirds, so that gives you A minor, C sharp minor, and F minor. So we're thinking about A as the root and moving up in major thirds, right? So A minor, C sharp minor, F minor. So that C sharp, although against an A chord, it's obvious A minor, it's the major third, but it's root of C sharp minor. So if you play something goes from C sharp minor down to A minor, or you can go up C sharp minor, F minor to A minor, the parallel nature of what you're playing justifies that wrong sound. So
just justifies it.
Or yeah, I call it justifying it or neutralizing it.
In your head, let's see. I'm trying to phrase this. What is the where does the part come in? Does it sound good? That was
yes.
After all that pausing, that was a heck of a adjective.
Well, yeah. Two things. You asked the question earlier about system and structures and patterns. That's the dangerous thing about practicing this way is you don't want to sound too mechanical and sound like you're playing too many patterns. So you have to practice patterns to not be afraid of that C sharp over A minor, because you know how to get back to where you need to be. And then slowly but surely, when you practice this way, it just becomes a natural way of hearing music, as opposed to. So to me, that you want to be able to kind of really combine the brain and the heart and the ears. So the brain comes in when you're studying the theory and practicing all the patterns, and then the ears come is like when I hear when A minor on the piano, I hear that C sharp now as part of the. It's a totally acceptable note to use. It's not anything to be afraid of because I know how to relate that back to the A minor. I lost your voice.
Okay. The actual pitch of the C sharp, in other words, if you're playing at the high end of your sex or in the middle, is that part of your decision to play it, where it's actually coming out in relationship to the piano chords, or?
No, not really. Maybe because of where I was before in terms of the line, but not in relationship to like the range of the piano.
Okay.
But I don't know what this is going to sound like, but just quickly. So if we're thinking A minor, right? So when I hear that and we're thinking about the three minor chords that are related by major thirds. So you have right. So if we're hearing something as this is the root, so we get that in our ears. If the bass is playing it or the piano or whatever, you can go. So there I started immediately on C sharp minor, went up to F minor, back to C sharp, and then back to A. So it depends if you have 16 measures of A minor or you have 2 measures, about how much time you have to get to where you want to go. So that
is that technique under your fingers now? Or,
yes.
Okay.
But it's also like I said, it's a combination of it being between in my fingers and in my ears, and hearing that as not anything that I'm all of a sudden like afraid of playing. It's kind of, that's one of the first notes I'll go for, and sometimes.
Oh,
And a good way to practice that is to just play an A minor on the piano and play that wrong note and listen to where it wants to go. Right. So I don't have a keyboard here with me, but if we're going, we're getting that in our ears, and somebody goes.
It just occurred to me it's almost the opposite of if you're playing an A blues, there's a C sharp in the chord, but the C natural is like the blue note, which
Right.
people will go to that constantly. And so you're sort of flipping harmonically. You've got the major against the minor.
As opposed to the minor against the major. Yeah. That's part of it. Except say when I'm playing a blues and we play the blue note, I'm not really thinking that, or sometimes I am, but not normally. I'm not thinking about that as a group of triads in relationship to A. It's just a note that wants to go up a half step.
Okay.
And the same thing, even when you're playing C sharp over A minor, you can just think about it as. So that's just going up A minor triad. So at that point, I'm not playing C sharp minor triad or anything. It's just where that C sharp wants to come back down to the minor third.
Okay.
But you could extend it. So that C sharp represents C sharp minor. But it also could just represent a note that wants to go a half step down to the minor third. So, as a result of practicing really simple things, but in all those different relationships, so minor triads and half steps. So I'm only just doing a little portion of it, but that's minor triad kind of going up and down in half steps, then whole steps. And minor triads and minor thirds. And then minor triads and major thirds.
When you practice that kind of thing, do you start in different places on your horn?
Yeah, I do it always from the bottom note, the lowest note possible, up to as high as I can play. So I try to cover the whole range.
I see.
So depending on, and that's a minor triad in root position, right? Well, then you do the same thing with a minor triad in second inversion. Right, so that's a completely different shape. And then when you take that through the routine, it has different ramifications.
Thank you for all this.
No, of course. No, my pleasure. I mean, it's fun to talk about.
It's interesting because over the years, as I've started to, we started interviewing fellas that were in their 80s and 90s, and that was 30 years ago. Then I started asking the question of mid-generation players: is there any such thing in improvising as a mistake. And mostly you get the quick response like, no, no mistakes. And I like to say, like, well, I have sure found them. But in your description is very helpful. And I also think there's part of it that is the way you deliver it with a bold tone and unapologetically, that has a lot to do with it.
Of course. Yeah.
Hmm.
If anything, I find I still sometimes make mistakes rhythmically because I haven't spent as much time on that as I have on harmony and melody. And for years I've been telling myself I want to learn to play the drums, and I still haven't, because Liebman and Brecker and Lovano, they all play really great drums, and that has to help. So there's still sometimes where I kind of doubt my rhythmic placement, and just that little millisecond of hesitation ruins it for me. So it's a mistake just because I'm not completely confident, or there's, like I said, that little thing of hesitation.
Okay. Well, for a working musician these days, it's obviously important to be versatile. And it was interesting last week that I was re-listening to, by the way, the title Widow's Walk. When did that come into the creation of that work?
I actually don't remember. Sometimes, I don't know if it's the same for you. Actually, finding the title for the song is harder than writing the song.
Indeed.
And sometimes where I'll have a title and that makes writing the song easier, because you automatically have either a mood or an emotion that is associated with that title. But I didn't. That's not the case with Widow's Walk. But the title, I don't remember hearing when or how I heard it, but to me it was like perfect for that mood of that song. And for those people who don't know what a Widow's Walk is, it's the perch around the top of a lighthouse, where the women would go out to sea if the ships were coming back. And a lot of times, unfortunately, they would come back, but without their husbands or their boyfriends. So, so that was just a haunting image to me.
Yeah. It all works. Where I was going was that when I listened to it, and you know how YouTube is, you're watching something, and then over on the right-hand side, you might want to watch this.
Yeah.
There was this video of you playing with Miles and an extended solo, and you were like really giving it all you had, and you're surrounded by electronic instruments, and the contrast between those two pieces of music was very telling.
Mm.
I wondered, when you were playing with Miles in that kind of situation, did you ever get into a situation where you're playing and playing, and in your head you're thinking, okay, Miles, I'm done now. like, can we move on?
Maybe. Yeah, because we all had usually one solo the night that was our main feature. I took other solos throughout the night with him, but there was that one. It's on Human Nature, the Michael Jackson song, and it was just concert A minor, so B minor. Are you a tenor player? I didn't ask earlier.
Mostly alto and soprano.
Alto. So yeah. It was an A minor concert, so B minor for us. And I think that, I mean, he was so aware of what was going on that he sometimes probably let me go past that point where I thought I was finished, just to force me to find something else. And I tell you, that feeling was better than feeling like I had more to go and then have him cut me off. Which sometimes, occasionally that happened where I felt like I was not really finished, but you're kind of playing yeah, because of course you don't tell him when you're finished. He's going to come and tell you. So you're kind of playing, and you get to a certain point in your solo where you know it's about that time where it might be close to the end. So kind of playing, but looking over your shoulder to see where he was.
I mean, physically where he was, like,
Yeah, because he would usually kind of come over, and when he was close to you, he would kind of play something that would cue the band, and that was it.
okay.
Uh, so
Did you
yeah, there were.
did you have rehearsals for that? It was 6 or 7 weeks that you played with them, that at least what I read. And were there rehearsals before that? Because he's not calling tunes like Green Dolphin Street.
um, no, there wasn't, and um, I could tell you quickly the story of how I got the gig is um, I was living in New Orleans at the time, and my friend from high school and college, his name is Matt Pearson, who's a producer now. He was working as an intern at Blue Note. And he said, put together a demo tape because I can get it to Bruce Lunbaugh, who's the president of Blue Note, and we might be able to do a record together. So I sent a tape and he played it for Bruce. And Bruce said, yeah, let's do the record with him. But Matt also sent that same tape to Tommy LaPuma, who was producing Amandla at the time. And some weeks later, I was still living in New Orleans and I got a call from Tommy saying, Rick, I just heard the tape and I played it from Miles over the phone, and Miles told me to call you and tell you you have a job.
Wow.
So yeah, that was like extraordinary. Of course, one of the highest, most extraordinary moments in my life, just to have that happen. And of course, the tape was good, and I had to be able to deliver. But it was also a case of who you know, because if it wasn't for Matt being in New York at that time and knowing that he was going to, that Miles was in the studio, and like all the coincidence that had to happen for that to happen was pretty amazing. So the original thing was, it was two saxophones. It was me with Kenny Garrett, and I had seen that band in that show a couple of times. So it was kind of at that point in Miles' career, it was kind of like the same structure every night. There wasn't too many variations, so I kind of knew what the show was about. So I flew to New York, and yeah, Tommy said Miles wants to meet me. So of course I was scared shitless. It's like I have no memory of getting in an airplane, of flying to New York. I don't remember how I got in the city. Like I don't. It's really strange. I don't remember any of that. I just remember ending up at the Essex House, the Marriott on Central Park South, which is where Miles was living, and got to his door, and it said, "Please take off your shoes." So I was standing there with my horn and my shoes for about 15 minutes, and I finally got the courage to knock on the door. And he opened the door with a smile on his face, and he brought me in, and I was totally at ease. It was really, really an extraordinary moment. So, because I wasn't sure if he was going to ask me to play or what it was going to be like. And all he did was he said, "Sit down," and he went on his desk or this big dining room table and was searching through a bunch of tapes and papers, and he just gave me a cassette and he said, "I'll see you on stage."
Wow.
So, so I transcribed a couple of the melodies that I had heard already, just so I was equipped, just ready to do that. But I didn't really have to do that much playing of the melodies by myself because Kenny was there. And this is also an amazing story. We were in Stockholm. That was the first gig. And after that gig, Miles collapsed backstage. He fainted. So yeah, he was not in the best of health, obviously. So the next day we were getting on the bus and he comes to me and says, "It's too much energy to have another person on stage," because that means he has to figure out where to give somebody else an extra solo and kind of change. So he said, "I'll call you when Kenny leaves." So I played one gig and I flew back to New York like 2 days later. And I was like, what just happened? Did I suck? Did he not like, all the questions? And I think it was about a month later, they were getting ready to do their next leg of the tour, which was 6 weeks. And he called me and said, Kenny just left. We need you. And the first gig I played was in Stockholm. So I started where I left off. And from that point, I did the 6 weeks without Kenny. Um, and the show was the same. And so no rehearsal. We just went out there, and the band exact was exactly the same. So I was just there, but by myself, like, not with Kenny, and just playing the little melodies and short little things that I needed to do. And yeah, no rehearsals. And sound checks, Miles was never there. We just went and checked the sound without him.
You can't make this kind of thing up, can you?
I know it's extraordinary.
Was it the loudest you'd ever played, the loudest group you'd ever played in, or did you have experience before that in funk bands or that kind
Yeah, because when I was living in New Orleans, I played in some blues bands on Bourbon Street that were pretty loud. Um, because we also weren't playing in clubs; they were all pretty big venues, so it was loud, but never so loud because I actually played in big bands that were louder because you have brass sections right behind you, so it really wasn't that bad because we were spread out on the stage.
of? Yeah. Wow, thanks for sharing that.
No, my pleasure.
What prompted you to relocate to Paris?
Well, I was living in New York. Well, I lived at this point. I was in New Orleans, and when the Blue Note thing happened and Miles happened, that was 1989 or so. I always wanted to move to New York, so I moved to New York around '89, and was there for about 10 years. And at that point, in New York, there still was not, you're doing these little gigs, but you're not making a lot of money. And since I was kind of new on the scene, I got calls to come over to Europe to do jazz festivals. And that's where a majority of American jazz musicians make decent money, is by coming over to Europe and playing. Unless you're really famous and you're able to tour around the country with your own band, but that takes a while to get to happen. So it really didn't happen for me. I was coming over to Europe and making more of a name for myself that way. And I always loved Paris. Um, and I thought this would be a cool place to live because just the city itself. And I realized it's kind of the hub of Europe. So it makes getting to Germany, to Austria, to Belgium, to Amsterdam, to London on a train really easy. So, of course, because what we do, there is a lot of traveling involved, but the trains are always much cooler than the airports. So I kind of planted that seed, and I had some friends who were living in Paris, but I never really did anything proactive about finding my way over here. Just kind of thinking it would be a cool thing to do, and it was in 2000. Well, before that, I think around 2001, I got asked to join a French band called the Mouton Reunion Quartet. It's the twin brothers, and the bass player, Francois, lived in New York. His brother, Louis, lives in Paris. And I became friends with Francois, and they had a working band, and their saxophone player left. So Francois asked me if I wanted to join the band. So that means I was coming over to France even more. I was living in an illegal sublet on the Upper West Side, and we got caught. So I was going to have to find another place to live in New York, which is always very traumatic and not cheap. And a relationship I was in with a girl had ended like a couple months before that. And yeah, so there was three things. And then a friend of mine in Paris who knew I was talking about moving here, he actually called me and said, Rick, I'm leaving. If you want, you could have my apartment.
The planets aligned.
So the universe gave me like four major signs. And I said, if I don't do this, something bad is going to happen. And I said, if I don't do it, I also am going to regret not taking the chance. So yeah. And I said, if I didn't like it, I could always move back.
Yeah.
Um,
What did mom and dad think?
Actually, I was really nervous about telling them, and I remember because we were I grew up in Detroit. We're all from Detroit, but at that point, my parents had moved to Nevada. They lived near Las Vegas in Henderson. And I remember finally getting the courage up to talk to them on the way to the airport. They were driving me home after Christmas, and I was flying back to New York. And I said, I just got a chance to move to Paris. What do you think? And they were both really happy. My father's like, that would be an amazing experience for you. So other than making it more difficult for me to get home to see them, because obviously to travel from Paris to Las Vegas is like,
Okay.
it's not easy. So, but yeah, so they were supportive. And once I got here, and it wasn't like I was moving to Paris without knowing anybody. So I had a reputation and I had some friends here. So it was it was relatively kind of easy, and also having a place to live that I knew about. And
I want to read, this is connected to jazz in Europe, and had an interview with Pierre Boussaguet, and he said this about American jazz. He says it's an honor. He was talking about playing with visiting jazz musicians, an honor because jazz to me has always been, historically speaking, a pure American art form that's so powerful, so joyful that it's spread throughout the world. And another quote from the pianist Rossano Sportiello from Italy, who now lives here. He said, the most beautiful compliment that we could tell each other was, tonight you sounded like an American. So my question is, nowadays, do jazz musicians in France still aspire to sound like Americans, or have they developed their own personality?
I think it's more the latter than the former. I don't know exactly, like, time period wise, like when the university or the conservatory system started here with jazz departments. Like, it didn't, I think maybe earlier in the States than it has over here. But like the main conservatory here in Paris, there are a lot of great young musicians, and they're definitely into, I don't want to say avant-garde because it's not just that, but it's more about writing their own original music that has kind of like a ECM kind of a European quality. They're not really playing bebop, although teachers are teaching that as something you have to have. But that's not the end. It's just kind of a means to the end, means to an end. So I would say, yes, it's definitely less about emulation and sounding American, except they're obviously influenced by, a lot of the young piano players, I think, as opposed to maybe sounding like Wynton Kelly, they're into Brad Mehldau, right? Which it just, I guess that's kind of a natural generational thing. Although we're also telling these young guys, before you go to Brad, you have to check out Wynton, because Brad checked out Wynton. So it's like the whole lineage part of developing. But they're definitely the younger generation. They're more into the odd meter kind of thing, blending Afro or ethnic kind of world music stuff. Steve Coleman kind of influence, Robert Glasper, so there's more of that going on. So maybe influenced by American musicians, but a different generation of them.
If you went to a jam session in Paris, is it old fashioned to say, all right, let's do a blues in B flat?
No, but that's the other part of it. Well, the older I get, the harder it is for me to leave the house. If I'm home, I'd rather just stay home and practice or compose. So I'm not out as much. But if I am already out and it's not that, and it's close to the time when the sessions are going to start, the jam sessions are still pretty conservative, though, to answer your question. And it depends on the night. It depends who's there. The level there could be a couple great players and a couple less experienced players. So kind of the common ground is still let's play Stella or let's play a standard. So when you go out to a jam session, it's not really the kind of experimental stuff I was talking about earlier. But it's more if you're going to go hear a young French group play their music, it's going to be more originals and something a little bit less beboppy, for lack of a better term.
I don't know if you can address this question depending on how long you've been over there, but do you think it's as challenging for your students to find a way to make a living in this music as it has become in the States?
I'm just speculating on how difficult it is in the States because I haven't been there in a while, but I imagine it's hard. Um, there's more support. There's more support from governments and from little cultural centers all around France, and I assume the same in Germany. And of course, it's different after COVID, but there are more places to play and more respect for artists in Europe in general. That's also one of the things that led me to wanting to move here. So for young musicians, I imagine that there are more resources in terms of getting funding for little projects. And like I said, little cultural centers where you can play and put on concerts. And because everything is so close and each scene is different. So if you're in France, you can go to Germany on a train in 3 hours and be part of a completely different scene, as opposed to, say driving from New York to Philly, you're still part of the East Coast scene. So there's going to be kind of the same amount of exposure as opposed to going to a completely different country. And of course, just our generation, because of the all the streaming stuff now, and the lack of record labels, it's something that we have to deal with because it's not part of our wheelhouse. But for them, having an Instagram account and putting your records and doing your shit on there, that's just like they don't know what they're missing, so that's just what they do.
They don't know what they're missing. I like that. Yeah, we could say, oh boy, back in our day, we had, but even back then, people, when you had a record label, mostly they complained about it.
Yeah, that of course, that yeah, sure, they didn't do enough, but at least there were record labels. But then I talked to Dave Liebman and he says, yeah, you missed the golden age when there were 5 or 6 clubs in New York where there people were playing for 6 nights a week. Probably more than that, and a circuit around the States where you can get in and do that. I mean, I only played with my own band in New York for 6 nights, I think one time, the old Sweet Basils. But I never had that experience of going out and playing my own music for 40 weeks a year, which is extraordinary. Now, if I do 3 nights in a row, it's rare. And I feel the difference after the first night. My playing is completely different because there's a reference from the night before. So it's frustrating. And even now, I have a steady Monday night gig in Paris. We've been doing it for the last 5 years. And that's a luxury to have. But even once a week is definitely not enough. It takes me a set just to kind of feel loose, and then the gig is over. So, the good old days.
This is a question you can pass on if you'd like. As an American living abroad, do you observe the political and social scene in the United States, and how does it strike you?
Everybody that I've talked to over here is stunned by the stupidity of half the American public. They can't understand how this happened a second time. But everybody's also afraid because a lot of countries here are swinging to the right. Countries are getting more nationalistic because of the immigrants and COVID and all the shit that's happened. So it's scary. Brexit, Le Pen almost winning here in France. I don't remember the name of the prime minister in Italy. The woman. Sweden has gone a little further to the right. So it's kind of happening everywhere, but none of them can compare to Trump in terms of lack of intelligence and evil agenda and the shit he's gotten away with. And so I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and it's striking that half the country feels like you do, and myself, and so forth. And not to make a political agenda out of this interview, but I was curious from the other side of the ocean what the feeling is.
Everybody is shocked, and frankly, they're frightened by what's going to happen economically because of the tariffs and all the stuff he's talking about doing, and then also what's going to happen to Ukraine and the war in Israel. I mean, so yeah, everybody's is on heightened alert, I would say, and depressed.
Okay.
Yeah, where do we go from there?
I'm looking at here's where we're going. I'll sort of wrap up with on both sides of me in my office here, I have a list of sort of a discography of you, and it has all your records under your own name. And so I'm going to pick two things that you did and see if you have a memory or comment about them. And I'll start with Ellis Marsalis, A Night at Snug Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about that date?
Well, Snug Harbor is one of the only few clubs at that time that was doing modern jazz. So that's where I played almost all the time. Other than that, I was doing weddings and club dates and stuff like that. I remember being a little chaotic because there was a cast of characters and not everybody played on every song. So there was a lot of kind of moving around. There wasn't that much planned in advance other than a possibility of a couple different songs. So a little bit chaotic, but knowing everybody in the club and all the musicians and the vibe was cool. So it was just kind of like, just hang out until it's time to play. And at that point, I was still a little unsure of myself musically, so maybe a little intimidated by the older generation. Like, am I ready to play with these guys? Am I good enough? So there's a little bit of that self-doubt. But mainly being on stage with friends, a pleasant experience. Yeah.
Okay. And Ellis was interesting guy.
Ellis was very cool. Once again, I was just this young little white guy in New Orleans, not knowing that many people. So I was kind of, in awe of him. And the same thing with Miles. I really didn't want to talk too much because I didn't want to say anything stupid. So, but he was a sweetheart. So it was just mainly, just being respectful and.
Nice. Yeah. Hey, how about, would you like to share something about, I don't know if this is your latest record, Sacred Hearts?
Yeah.
All original material.
All original material. Yeah. So the nucleus, the quartet on that record is the quartet that I work with here in Paris. And actually, the drummer is one of my oldest friends from New Orleans named Jeff Boudreau, who was in Paris before I was. Also, the bass player named Peter Giron is from New York, from the Bronx. So three expats and a French pianist. And we had been working together for the last 5, 6, 7 years. So going in there and having my band and the music that we had been playing made it relatively stress-free, because usually going into the recording studio could be kind of intimidating, but we just went in there and played our music. And that's the nucleus of the record. And I knew that after I had that stuff recorded, my plan was to then overdub percussion and guitars and some keyboards and singing. And so it's kind of like we did the first round. I don't want to say, and adding all the details made it go from color to black and white. I mean, from black and white to color, because it wasn't in black and white to begin with. But I feel like I went in there afterwards and then orchestrated it. And the tracks were done for a while, and then the rest of the process took even longer. So I think from beginning to the end, the whole record took almost 4 years, even though the majority of it was recorded in 4 days. The finishing of it and the mixing and mastering and orchestrating and bringing people in to do the overdubbing and all that was done in stages.
Did you have well, it could be a producer, but I'm thinking of an outside ear to, contribute that sound? Because sometimes it's hard to be objective about your own work.
Absolutely, it is. Not somebody who was in the studio working with me. I kind of had a general, because the record I made before that was kind of the same, but the basic tracks were more world music influence. This is more. I hate to compare it. If I had to compare, it's kind of like a Pat Metheny with saxophone sound, more kind of American, not as ethnic. So I had that first experience as an experience to help me. But then I would take certain tracks and then play it for the guys in the band and just snippets and say, what does this sound like? What do you think? So that's the only sounding board. I didn't really have a producer other than me. And then when we finally got to the mix, the engineer was really good. So he had some insights into how things should just be panned and of course balanced. And then he did have some suggestions for a couple of the arrangements, like maybe there are too many vocals at this point, so we could thin them out here. So yeah, okay. But mainly just kind of my own vision of what I wanted it to be.
When you said overdub, I can't believe that. I'm going back to it, the Widow's Walk. People have to listen to this, because one thing that I remember, especially the first time I heard it, was you were playing the melody on the tenor and then the soprano entered. Am I correct? I'm assuming that was you as well. It sounded like then there was an intertwining of two horns and then it ended up in unison.
Yeah, it is me. I'm trying to think. Yeah, the second voice is soprano. I'm pretty sure. I don't think I did it with two tenors. But yeah, on that first record, there's another one I did with I did the melody just with three horns, and it's kind of I've had fun doing that over the years. So, yeah. Sacred Hearts, it didn't start out originally with it being kind of this tribute album, but then it did as the material kind of fell into place. So each song is kind of dedicated to somebody that I lost, because between the recording of Sacred Hearts and the one I did before that, which is called Bohemia, it was like 9 or 10 years since I did a record under my own name. So Sacred Hearts has dedications to all the people that I had lost in those 10 years, but it's not really a sad record. It's more celebrating them, you
Nice.
know. So the one I wrote for Michael Brecker is called Country Mike.
Oh,
And at the end, there's a vamp that goes on for a while, and there are 9 different tracks of me improvising. And that was super fun to put together. Uh, and then the orchestrating of it, the melody itself has 3 or 4 sopranos playing with the piano. And if you haven't heard that one, I think you would enjoy it. And you can go on YouTube and find that one. But
I'll check it out. No wonder it took 4 years.
but I said even on that, it was took 9 of me to make one Michael Brecker, and not even then was I successful.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for your time. And I hope that people, after watching it, go check out your music. And thank you.
Mike, my pleasure. I really, there's certain people you kind of just start talking to, and it just feels natural. So I really appreciate you. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad to be part of lineage of the show.
All right. I'm going to end this and we'll just say goodbye.
Okay. Thanks, Monk.